Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we're going to be reviewing the 80s film, Beetlejuice, in anticipation of its sequel coming out right around the corner. All right, Sarah, kick us off with a summary of Beetlejuice.
The spirits of a deceased couple are harassed by an unbearable family that has moved into their home and hire a malicious spirit to drive them out.
All right. And in Movies in Us tradition, we are going to start off with our one-sentence summaries for Beetlejuice. Sarah, what is yours?
Mine is, ghosting isn't always a bad thing.
Nice. Yes, I love it. I love it. Not always. Sometimes it's very useful, very necessary. Yeah. And when you need to take back your territory, do what you need to do.
It's true. It's true.
My one-sentence summary is, his infomercial is the marketing genius of the day-o.
Yes, it is. Oh, well played.
Okay, let's dive in to share our thoughts and our relationship with Beetlejuice because it came out in the late 80s, I believe in 88. We are going to dive right into this movie, so this is your spoiler alert. If you haven't seen Beetlejuice, we're diving right in. Okay, Sarah, I'm curious to hear your relationship to Beetlejuice before this most recent watch, because I know that this is a cult classic. And it's so funny. We just reviewed Princess Bride, and now we're doing another cult classic, and it's fascinating to see these two back to back. And there's a whole thought train that I went on with that. But I'm curious for you what your relationship with Beetlejuice was before this recent watch.
Yeah, this is one that I have definitely seen before. I watched as a kid. I can't remember. I think we may have had it on VHS. If we didn't have it, then my grandma had it. So it was definitely in the movie library in the houses that I frequented. So watched it a number of times. It was interesting even the second that it started and that music came on with the credits, I was instantly transported. And I was like, oh, I distinctly remember this. And I haven't watched this movie, I don't know, like I was maybe middle school was the last time that I watched this. Like it's been a very long time, but there are certain distinct moments in this film that are just ingrained into my brain. And so it was fun to revisit it again after all these years. What about you?
Nice. So this was something that was beloved by family members that then got passed down and put on the TV when you were younger.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It was one that it was on. I don't know that it was one of my favorites, but I definitely watched it a number of times. Probably it was probably in the Halloween movie rotation growing up. That's probably when I watched it the most.
Got it. Yeah. I hadn't seen this movie before. This is a movie that I've heard about it. I have seen so many of the visuals and the Halloween costumes and the dress ups of this character from this movie, but I didn't come around to seeing it until this time. So I'm glad that the sequel is coming out so that I can finally experience this movie. It's one that we just didn't watch growing up. I think, again, immigrant parents are so much of 80s cultural references that I know are highly significant and get passed down and are a big part of people's childhoods. It wasn't part of mine. So it's fascinating to think about. I think there's a lot more things from the late or mid 90s and then into the 2000s, I think is perhaps that nostalgic piece of content that I will put on for my kids. But it's just fun to have thought about that of what will be those things that are passed down through families and through my family. But this one was not one that I was really in my orbit at all. So I came into Beetlejuice with a full fresh canvas. Mostly just knowing that it was a, like kind of cult beloved movie that people really connect with and seem to have a special love for.
Oh, okay. This is going to be so fun. I'm very excited to hear what you think about it. Just not having that context and not having that nostalgia factor that I know that I definitely have.
Yeah, and a lot of people that are around our age also have that like nostalgia factor of like, oh my gosh, I watched this all the time in the month of October growing up, or there's it's just got that energy around it. So, okay, let's dive in and share our thoughts about the movie itself now that we've established and included the context for our relationship to the movie going into this. What are your thoughts about Beetlejuice?
Yeah, I am just amazed that this movie exists because it's wild and chaotic, and I think even the story structure and the pacing is kind of chaotic too. Like this whole movie is just wild and creative, and you just see Tim Burton just kind of going crazy a little bit, and I love it. I'm like, this is so fun and wacky, and you see the actors just seem to be having so much fun doing what they're doing. Especially Michael Keaton is just having the time of his life, and you can just tell that a lot of heart went into this, and it's intentionally looks like a B movie. It intentionally looks cheap at times, and I find that so endearing. So, and it's a lot of nostalgia. I realize I am seeing this through nostalgia colored glasses, but I definitely had a fun time revisiting this again.
Yeah, yeah. It is kind of a miracle that this somehow was able to get made and exist. I was reading a little bit more about just the long and windy journey of the script and how it was meant to originally be more of a true horror film. And Beetlejuice was supposed to be this like really demonic, terrifying figure. And through some script doctoring, they really changed and evolved it to be this much more lighthearted and kind of crazy set of mayhem that unfolds that we get to see. I have a lot of thoughts about like the sets and everything and some of the effects that I think were really like such spectacle to see, and I'm intrigued to see now Beetlejuice that's coming out in the next couple of days here, to see that on the big screen. I think that'll be like such an experience. I would say overall, like, to no surprise to anyone, like this isn't like my kind of movie. And I had a long think about how there's such love for this, but I for so many it's associated with this like feeling of lightheartedness and silliness that I think is a big part of this character and of the story. It's just like wild and unhinged, and that being really fun for a lot of people has been interesting to read about, like what has made this film so beloved for so many years too.
And I think it's fascinating that this movie did well in the box office in
Mm-hmm.
1988. I had to look this up given that we just reviewed The Princess Bride, which didn't do very well at the box office despite it being a much more relatable, understandable, family friendly genre. Like it fits into a genre of movie where I feel like Beetlejuice is kind of just like wild and off the wall, and yet Beetlejuice made more than double The Princess Bride at the box office just like a handful of months later. It was like 6 or 7 months later, and I find that really really interesting that Beetlejuice was able to tap into a certain segment of the population in the 80s while it was in theaters that The Princess Bride didn't. And yet both of these have become cult classics and are absolutely beloved by so many. And that was shocking to me because if you would have just asked me, I would have guessed that it would have been the reverse because The Princess Bride seems like a much more palatable film to me and like more easily marketable to the masses. Whereas the Beetlejuice, I would be like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to market this in a way that would get the masses into the theaters. But man, they found an audience and then have found an even greater audience since it went to VHS and now streaming and all of the things.
Mm-hmm. And it is interesting to think about. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, especially with our last like few reviews between this one and Princess Bride. Just like what makes a film a cult classic? Like what's that special combination, that special sauce that somehow uh it makes a film so endearing for so many decades, you know? And one thing that these two films definitely have in common is that there's something that like is really out there and quirky and it swings for the fences in a big way, and that either works for you and it doesn't, and if it works for you you feel like you are seen and understood in such a special way, you know, that like this was for you. And it doesn't have like this traditional straight-laced mass appeal that we can probably ascribe to a lot of movies that are made that are meant to make money in a very like targeted ROI type of way, to try and appeal to the mass population. These films just they are so unapologetically swinging in a direction that like it seems like no one else had really swung in before then in this specific way. And I think there's something like about that uniqueness and that creativity that somehow made these films really endear themselves to people.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that word endear is like a big part of it. You know, these films are endearing and you watch them and there's something about them that you just you kind of want more of and you want to spend a little bit more time with them. And I think I mean when I think about cult classic films, that's how a lot of them I think are. There's something there is a draw that these movies have and you just want to spend time with these characters, you want to spend time on this adventure even if it's, you know, zany and wild and you just you want to watch it again. And there's something about them that it's just this kind of almost magnetic pull that some of these movies have and you just want to watch it again. And I think especially for movies like The Princess Bride and to some extent Beetlejuice, it these movies have become injected into our culture in a way that people you want to be in on it, you want to understand the reference, you want to get it, and so then that makes you kind of like seek out the movies too. So I think they both achieved that kind of cultural relevance that will continue to draw eyeballs to them, just because they're those movies that a lot of people have seen and they're just kind of in the cultural ethos, so you don't want to be left out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the best marketing a film studio could ever do for their film is like get it to the point of being part of that fabric of pop culture, and you just have to watch it, you know? I mean, I am the exception because I was just like, I hadn't got around to this one yet with the 10 million other films that are on our watch list. But here we are. I'm in on it now. And the sequel is about to come out as well. So there will be more Beetlejuice for all of the people that have been wanting more. One thing that was notable for me that I was surprised by is how little Beetlejuice is actually in this movie. And I think I was reading it's like 18 minutes of total screen time in this 90-minute movie. And that was so surprising to me. I kept waiting to see this character show up, and we're at the like 45-minute mark. The movie's halfway over, and I'm like, where is this character that is so iconic? And then he shows up, and then he's kind of gone for a long time too, and just kind of in and out in these very short little sequences. His presence is obviously so palpable and very felt by every character in this world, but his actual on-screen time is very short, and I didn't expect that. I thought this was going to be like the whole second half of the film of just absolute shenanigans with Beetlejuice, like one after the other, and we don't actually get that. So that was a shock to me.
Yeah, I forgot how little screen time he had. And I do appreciate, though, how this film, in some ways, almost treats Beetlejuice like the shark in Jaws. And you hear about him, you see a little bit of him, you hear his voice, you see the infomercial. Like, you know about him a little bit, and then you finally see him at about the halfway point. But even when he is not on screen, you feel his presence because he is such a malevolent force. And even when he's not there, you know that he is lurking. He's in the shadows. He wants to come into the frame, but he's just not able to yet. And so I do appreciate that he doesn't have a lot of screen time, but his presence is almost always felt once we know about him. And so I think that that's some really effective screenwriting and filmmaking to uh, have him there so little, and yet he is still very prominent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really is the less is more effect on full display, which really begs the question of how much he's going to be in this sequel. Like that's one thing that I was thinking about when reflecting back on how little he is in this one, and how that feeling of wanting more but not getting it, and it kind of makes every scene and moment that he is on screen pack a bigger punch, versus us being kind of exhausted by him by the end, or kind of the law of diminishing return of having to have the pressure of increasing mayhem, increasing shenanigans steadily throughout a 45-minute stretch, of the second half of this movie. What will they choose to do in the sequel? It's kind of going to be a fascinating question. So we will see how many minutes out of that film are we going to see Michael Keaton on screen? Because I actually think that that level of restraint and understanding that less is more is a big part of how this works so well.
Yeah, yeah. The movie never gets too distracted away from what really matters. We care about Adam and Barb, and then we care about Winona Ryder's character. What's her name? Lydia, I
Mm-hmm.
think. We
Lydia.
care about them. And so we want to follow those characters. And while Beetlejuice is fun and exciting and rambunctious, he is not the main character. He is, in some ways, the antagonist. I don't know. You could argue that Lydia's family is the antagonist, but and so it never gets too distracted by the shiny object that is Beetlejuice, and it keeps its eyes on the prize, which is how are Adam and Barb going to survive with this obnoxious family, destroying their home, and how is Lydia going to survive her obnoxious parents? Oh, and they just invited Beetlejuice, and he's going to make everything so much harder. So I love that the film stays focused when it could have been really easy to get distracted and, just like you said, have so many more hijinks from Beetlejuice, because he is so electric and so much fun to watch. But the movie knows, like you said, less is more.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the this new sequel will hold that to be true, and continue to carry that forward, or will we indulge in more, and will it work? Maybe the indulgence is gonna be like exciting to see just more of this character that is so beloved, but perhaps they also lean into more of the level of restraint that the first movie did, and I suppose we will see. But you're right. There's so much like time that the film spends getting us to invest in uh what's the families? The Barbara and Adam. I was shocked by that. Like we're at the 45-minute mark, and like those two are still just like rolling around confused, figuring out like what is going on. And so I think the pacing of this movie surprised me quite a lot. Like we spend so much time just building emotional investment in this couple for nearly the whole first half of the movie, and I would say so much of the actual big set pieces and the action don't happen until after that halfway point. And this is so different from, if we think about this movie from the lens of horror, it's like horror comedy, but a lot of times horror movies only spend about like 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. Um, with our straight-laced characters that are kind of stand-ins for the audience that we follow, and then like something demonic and terrifying happens, and then we kind of set off on this whole journey pretty fast. And so that pacing is just so different from the way a lot of, especially horror films, unfold today. um this is me, disclaimer, like I'm not like steeped in the horror genre, but from a lot of the ones that I have seen, that seems to be kind of the pacing that is followed. And so it's interesting to see this one take such a different approach.
Yeah, and the other part about the pacing that surprised me is how quickly everything is resolved in the end. There's this big buildup, and Beetlejuice is trying to marry Lydia, which is so creepy and so
Mhm.
gross and
Yep.
just ugh, evil. Uh, and then he's done. His name is said 3 times, and he goes away again. And then Lydia, seems to live happily ever after with her new ghost family plus her living family. And that really surprised me, that we're ramping up. Oh my gosh, he's so creepy, he's so gross, this is so evil. Oh no, is Lydia going to be okay? They say his name 3 times, done, happy ending. Oh, okay. That was really abrupt, and then the movie's over. So I think all of these things just make the pacing of the film feel a little bit off to me. And I think that just leans into this offbeat horror comedy business that Beetlejuice is doing. So for me, even though it feels weird, it kind of endears me to the movie even more. Again, I am viewing this through nostalgia colored glasses, so I'm sure that's a big part of it. But I love how everything is just a little bit off. And I think that makes it a more endearing film to watch.
Yeah, and that's something that I was thinking a lot about watching this movie without the nostalgia colored glasses that I just don't have. Um, is that so many of the choices that this film makes in another movie that doesn't work as well and is not beloved, like don't they actually genuinely make this a movie that people are not on board with, like it's critiqued and criticized for some of the things that actually are hallmarks of its genius. And so that's been fascinating to think about. And like, what is it about this film? Perhaps it's fresh for the time that it came out, and this is kind of like raunchy dark horror comedy thing, just being fresh and new and exciting, and opening people up to new possibilities that the so many of the other things that you typically would want or need or expect in a film were just kind of like, but that's not the point, like it's not, it ain't that serious, and why does that lens get put on for this film versus something else, that maybe falls into the same buckets of choices that it makes, but it's not working for the audience? That's been interesting to think about. It's almost like its flaws or its unconventional choices, again, endear the audience in some interesting way. But those same unconventional voices could also alienate the audience. It just didn't and hasn't for this film. But for another version or type of movie like this, you're kind of like, what are we doing? What's going on? That's a weird ending. That felt unsatisfying. But for this one, we don't view it from that lens. And so that's been interesting to think about, of like, why is that the case?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think that part of it is that it is kind of intentionally rough around the edges and is filmed kind of like a B movie, but
Mm-hmm.
intentionally so. And I think that lends itself to this cult classic status that it has. But I think that also makes some of these weird creative choices that wouldn't work in another film, they work here because it was filmed that way. And that was like Tim Burton's creative choice, was to film it like a B movie, and try to make like the effects look kind of tacky at times. And I think that rough around the edges characteristic that this film has makes those kind of weird plot decisions or the weird pacing decisions endearing rather than feeling wrong, because the whole thing is intentionally a B movie.
Mm-hmm. It really is like uh campy, you know. It's like the perfect word to describe this. It's
Yeah.
like intentionally big and dramatic and silly and overemphasized or extravagant to be the extravagant, and to be playful and amusing, very intentionally so, by using these like kind of big broad ways of both visually but also in the storytelling, is to exaggerate and do it for the purpose of being wacky and fun.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting to also think about how this film has influenced so many others like it too. So I very recently watched the movie Lisa Frankenstein, which came out,
Mm,
I think it was either this year or last year, I don't remember, but it came out recently. And it reminds me of Beetlejuice in a lot of ways. The subject matter is very different, but it's another film that is intentionally campy. It's filmed kind of like a B movie at times, you know, like there are very deliberate choices to go in this like 80s camp route. And I think in a lot of ways it patterns itself off of Beetlejuice. And it's just fascinating to see this weird, quirky movie has been so influential, not only in culture, but there are some filmmakers who are still drawing inspiration from it and trying to do their own version or innovate what Tim Burton did in the 80s. And I think that that's just really cool.
mm-hmm. And they, I'm sure, had no idea the lasting effect and legacy and impact that this film that they just had a joy creating would have, you know, which is, I think, the part that makes this special too. I was reading a lot about how um they really just spent so much time like riffing together, like Michael Keaton especially, just like riffing on these like silly ideas and concepts to weave into the script, and how much it was born out of that like silliness in the working sessions that made it into this movie. So much wasn't manicured and well defined and planned for, but a lot of it was spontaneous and chaotic, in the same way that Beetlejuice's character is spontaneous and chaotic. And I think that the film is able to capture that energy, but it's neat to see that the creative process was also that way. You know, this was not carefully constructed uh pieces and lines and whatnot every step of the way. In fact, it was kind of silly and chaotic in all of the ways that the movie is as well.
And I love it when that happens in movies. Like obviously there are some movies that you need to follow the script and dialogue has been created for a reason and please follow it. But a movie like this that is just fun and playful, it's so like joyous to see the actors having that ability to just riff and have fun and go with the flow. And it was also fascinating to read about Michael Keaton's creative process and how much he shaped the look of Beetlejuice and how he was able to like speak into this character and how he should look and how he should be. And he took so much ownership of Beetlejuice that has now become so iconic. And I love reading about that because the whole movie is so creative, and then for Tim Burton to be able to give the actors and others that creative space for them to also operate, you know, it wasn't just his creative vision, but a lot of people were involved and a lot of people had a say. And I think that that's what helps make this movie so fun.
Mm, hmm. Yeah, no, that's so true. And that is important, you know. And I think it makes this amalgamation of ideas coming together, instead of kind of the singular one version vision of what this could be. But like the movie's probably much better for it when there's kind of space for the characters and the actors and whatnot to all like put their little piece in it, and therefore also bring that to life in a much more authentic way when they are playing that role, because they were part of that creative process too. It's neat to see. It doesn't always happen, you know, in some of these projects and films where there maybe is much more of like a singular vision that needs to be executed on, and we're storyboarding like frame by frame how it's going to play out. Just such different styles of the creative process.
Hmm. Yeah. And what I love is that really there's not like a right or wrong way to do it. This like creative, collaborative way isn't necessarily better than, the storyboarding way and very clear vision and you have to do it this way. Like there's pluses and minuses to both. And I love that this movie was able to come about from that creative collaboration. And I think it just lends itself to this movie because it's so creative and the story is so chaotic and Beetlejuice is such a chaotic character that it just makes sense. It's perfectly in line with the character of the film, how they created it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's so true. Uh, I'm curious as we think about, you know, we're watching Beetlejuice in preparation for the sequel, and we've kind of referenced it a few times in our conversation so far. But what are your thoughts about one, the fact that this movie's getting a sequel, but then two, is there anything that you are hoping to see or ensure that they steer clear of and avoid as they as we head into watching the next rendition of this world?
Yeah. I think it's kind of wild that we're getting a sequel after so many years. I don't, I honestly don't have big expectations for it. I'm not like super invested in the sequel. So I don't know. I hope that they follow a similar pattern to this. So like we were talking about with um less is more with Beetlejuice. I think that's probably the right way to go with this, but I could be wrong. And I'm just curious to see uh Winona Ryder as
Mm-hmm.
a full-grown adult in this. She's such a good actress and I feel like she's often overlooked, and I'm just excited to see her. Lydia is so important in the first Beetlejuice, and now we're going to see adult Lydia, and I think her daughter. Um, and so, what does Lydia look like now? How has her life changed since she was maybe like 15ish when Beetlejuice was happening? So I think that's going to be really fascinating, and I think one of the hard things about adapting a movie or having a sequel to a movie, what, oh man, I'm gonna do math and this is bad, but like 30 plus years later, is it's hard sometimes to adapt the story to the stage of life that the characters are now in. And so, like in an action movie, you can't have, a 60-year-old protagonist running like you had when he was 20. So you have to change the story a little bit to adapt to where the protagonist is now. And I'm hoping that the story is able to do that with the sequel to Beetlejuice, because Lydia has to be different than she was as a kid. And so what does that look like? What does, presumably returning to her family home. I haven't seen any trailers. I don't know what the movie is about. But how does her life look now that she is an adult? And then what are the little seeds of her 15-year-old self that we're going to see in her now as a fully formed adult? I think that's going to be really interesting to see.
Mm, yeah, yeah. And I am also intrigued to see how the style of humor is uh, grounded in much of what we saw from this like late 80s version. or how the tune of that and the tones of the humor also have this like modern integration into it. I think that's just like humor's so hard and it's so ingrained into a time and place and what was typical of that time and place. So it's almost when we watch films from previous decades, we kind of have an understanding of like this is from the late 80s or is from the 90s, and so we calibrate our expectation of humor and how that feels and looks to the time and place of where the movie's from. And that's also, brings us these warm fuzzies of like, oh my gosh, I remember this style of humor and it was so cool and it was so nostalgic. How are they going to do that in this modern sequel? I think is going to be an interesting challenge, especially because uh, humor today is a lot more stratified. And so, what will they choose to stick to the style and the tones of the first movie and kind of do a reboot of it and bring us back in time and all of that and all those ways, or are they going to do something like new and fresh and a little bit more like modern and updated? I think that's going to be a difficult task, but we are like seeing so many films like get newer versions of them created, or sequels created. It's kind of been, that nice uh 3 to 4 decades period that has passed where it feels like time now. I'm thinking about Space Jam for some reason as one example of this, of like that
Yes.
that's a movie that was so iconic then, and they kind of did this like modern fresh take on it in the sequel that came out. I forget when it was, a year or two ago, and it didn't really work as well, and so I wonder how that's going to play out and what approach they choose to take. I don't envy that task, but I think with humor, it is especially more notable and just different from some of the like big action movies where some of that just matters a little bit less and it's less significant to the spirit of the original movie. And it's a little, I don't know, it's a little easier to do inject that sense of modern sensibility in it, and especially with the new technology and the visuals, like you kind of get a lot that you can do and make it feel like an enhancement. um Harder with humor. And so I'm fascinated to see how that shakes out.
No, you make a really good point. And that's a really good question of which way is Beetlejuice going to go? Because there are some jokes in Beetlejuice where I was like, oh, that was not funny. Uh, but what are they going to do? Is Beetlejuice's cringy, sometimes gross and off-putting humor, is that part of his charm, or can he maybe change a little bit and I don't know, have an updated type of humor? um, I think it's also, you have Alec Baldwin, you have Gina Davis, you have Catherine O'Hara, like you have very funny actors in
Yeah.
Beetlejuice that I think also help. And so it's not just up to Beetlejuice to be the comedic element in this film, but you have other actors who can bring different styles of humor into it. I'm curious what they're going to do in the sequel, and how maybe some of the other actors can provide those moments of comedy, and maybe those could be more updated forms of humor if Beetlejuice is, stuck in his old gross ways and that's just part of his charm. Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to see how they do this, cuz these sequels decades later are so hard to pull off. And I think sometimes they get it right. So that's like Top Gun Maverick,
Maverick. Yeah.
so good. I would even say it's not as good as Top Gun Maverick, but the new Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F, that came out on Netflix, I had a great time with that film. It's not as good as the first one, but it's a solid like decades later sequel. But then you have the bad versions, like the new Space Jam, which, man, the first one is so much better, and then the newest Matrix movie. So I think this, decades later sequel formula, it's high risk, high reward. And so it's going to be really interesting to see where the second Beetlejuice falls on that spectrum.
Yeah, very much so. But I think you bring up a really great point, actually, which is that so much of this original Beetlejuice is kind of these normal people, for lack of a better word, that are big and colorful and personalities, but they are like from the real world, interacting with and reacting to the shenanigans of Beetlejuice. And for this new version, we can have modern characters that feel like they are from 2024, the modern era, and their humor and style maybe a little bit more aligned to what we see more commonly today in our style of humor. um, but Beetlejuice, from what I've read briefly about the premise, is like called back from the dead. Basically, his name is called 3 times and he's returned again to Lydia's family and now her daughter. And so Beetlejuice can still be who he was because he is supposed to have been like basically hibernating for the past 30 years and is now being called back. And so time perhaps has not passed as much for him. And so he is still that beloved character that feels so familiar and so comforting for so many people. But he's colliding with these human beings that are quote unquote real people that feel more modern and up to date. And so then you kind of can get the best of both worlds. You don't rewrite so much of who Beetlejuice is as a character to the point where it's like, what did you do with this character that we love? Like, oh my gosh, no, this is not him. You can still have him be just as much him, but he's colliding with these people that feel a little bit more like us for the modern sensibilities, the modern audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's going to be really fascinating to see. There's just so many ways for this movie to go wrong, and
Yeah.
I hope that it turns out good and that it's entertaining and fun and all of the things that the original one is, and that it's not just a nostalgia cash grab, but it's actually like a good, thoughtful, worthwhile story. Bringing Beetlejuice into the modern era. It's gonna be it's high risk, high reward is really what it is because so many people love this movie, and it's like we talked about, it's in the culture. It also has spawned, an animated series. It there was a Broadway play based on it.
Yeah.
Like this is a big deal, and like people love this movie, so they have to do the sequel right. They just have to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we will be here for it. Yeah. One of the things that I think was notable in this film that I'm also curious to see what they do in the sequel is the set design and like the visuals.
Mm-hmm.
I,
Yeah.
it's so much a part of the character of this movie and that sense of world building that was created through these sets and these like these tactile looking visuals that you could like reach through the screen and like touch and feel the textures of the different creatures in the caseworker's office, like all of these worlds that are wild and wacky. They feel so um they just feel so real. And I think that's also part of what makes this so endearing is that it feels so like created and loved through the creation of these sets. That whole like hallway that Adam and Barbara walk through as they're going in and out of the afterlife, the world of the afterlife, like the shapes and the angles and the colors that are used in that sequence is so it's just so distinct visually. And I'm so intrigued to see, we've got modern technology now and we've got, all this like these tool sets, but I hope we don't use a lot of them. It's kind of my feeling. I'm like, I hope we like paper mache a bunch of these creatures again for the sequel because I think it is such a big part of what makes this late 80s Beetlejuice so distinct and so it just the world feels so created.
Oh, yes. That's what I want too. I want practical effects. I want to see, puppets and animatronics or whatever, however they create these wonderful magical worlds that they created. That is what I want. And I love watching movies that are, from the 80s or a little bit older, because everything for the most part had to be practical effects, and they had to figure out creative ways to make some of these things happen. And so I hope that they don't lose that in the second film, because like you said, that tactileness, that realness is part of what endears you to this film. And the sets are so wonderfully creative, and it's just such a fun way to look at the afterlife. And like I love when they're in the waiting room and they have to take a number, and the numbers are so long, and it's going to take forever for them
Mm-hmm.
to finally get to meet their caseworker. So there's just these little things that are so funny, and they're reflective of our world today, and they're just used in this different context to make them humorous. And so I hope we see more things like that in the second film as well, because there's so much opportunity for fun and playfulness. Even though this movie is about death, it's still really fun and playful, and so I hope that the second movie maintains that as well.
Yeah. Well, and the themes of the first one are pretty like fascinating and interesting. If you like want to, after you're done laughing, like you have time to think about it more, of just like this kind of thesis that the afterlife is not that different from our normal life. You know, you've got like caseworkers that don't have time for you. You have to like wait in lines, and the bureaucracy of getting things done is still very much present. And it's all like a system and a society with processes and inefficiencies that are not that different from our day to day. And so you go from like one set of problems to the next set of problems, and there's something that's like oddly comforting about that fact of like you can't, we won't escape it, so we might as well just like embrace it and laugh along the way. And so that'll be fun to see too, is like what things are swirling around in the minds of these creators that they want to somehow like infuse into this like silly wacky experience. But there's some things to say too that the 80s Beetlejuice has, that I'm intrigued to see what's the 2024 version of commentary about our society, which is going to be interesting to see as well. That gets woven in.
Yeah, yeah. What are we going to cover in 2024? We don't
Mhm.
know.
We don't know, but we will be here to find out. Uh, any other big things that you wanted to mention about Beetlejuice before we wrap?
I really loved that so much of this movie is just Adam and Barb trying to figure out how to be ghosts and how to haunt this family. It's just so much fun to watch them try and figure out how to do that, because they're newly ghosts. They don't know how to do this stuff. They don't know how to do a haunting. And so it was just so fun to watch them. They start out with like the woo and like the spooky noises
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot, and then they're dressed in the sheets, and it's so funny to just see them. And the other people who have been dead longer are like, oh yeah, just haunt them, like no big deal, you can do it, you can handle this yourself. And they're just struggling with how to do so. So I thought that was such a fun and silly thing to watch them do, and uh really helps make this film as lighthearted as it is, because the way that they are trying to haunt this family is just so silly. And I loved those moments, and like seeing, okay, what are they going to come up with next, and everything was just sillier than their last attempt.
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, that's like pretty long sequence of this movie. They spend like the whole first half, the 45-minute mark that I was mentioning earlier, before Beetlejuice shows up. The whole first half is basically that same bit again and again and again, just in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. And it's satire in a lot of ways. So, we're making this comparison to The Princess Bride. It's like taking something that is so clear and familiar to us and kind of flipping it and doing all these like unexpected, fun, surprising things to like play with what we know to be so ingrained and so established in a genre type, and to just like totally just view it from this silly lens and to play with those ideas is kind of fun. So perhaps there's something that's like joyous about that for us as viewers too, that we just get a kick out of it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so fun and funny and like weirdly wholesome, you know? Like I if I had to haunt a family that was destroying my home that I loved so much, I don't know what I would do either. So it's just so fun to watch them try and figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. And immediately relatable to them when like all they want to do is just like be home and not be bothered by their relatives. I'm like,
Right? Yeah.
that's very efficient with character connection building for me as a viewer. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
rooting for
when
you.
they're
Protect your
yeah,
peace, you know? So if there's new people moving
exactly.
in that are snooty, like, heck, we got to get them
Hmm.
out.
Right? And I love that their perfect vacation is just 2 weeks at home alone. I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Working on
I
their
feel
passion
that deeply in
projects.
my core. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of Beetlejuice. You can find it available to stream on Max. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. So everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about Beetlejuice. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at Movies and Us Pod, or you can email us at moviesandUsPod@gmail.com. As we mentioned, we are here. We are going to be reviewing Beetlejuice 2 next week. It's coming out in a couple of days here. So we've done our homework now. We have remembered the original and really seeped in it. And now we are here for the next one. So we'll be here next week to discuss Beetlejuice 2. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you again very soon.